Isabella Vasquez's heart pounded in her chest, but it wasn't fear. It was him. Trapped between the cold office wall and the burning presence of Gabriel Westbrook, she could feel every inch of his body against hers. His fingers brushed along her waist, gripping the thin fabric of her dress with an intensity that made her pulse race. His dark eyes locked onto hers, filled with arrogance and a dangerous level of desire. "You love playing with fire, don't you?" His voice was a low rasp against her ear, his breath warm and taunting. Isabella bit her lip. She knew she should step away, that this was reckless, but every fiber of her being ached for more of his touch, more of his scent, more of him. The locked door behind them muffled the sound of the extravagant gala happening just outside, a charity event for New York's elite where she was supposed to be invisible. Just another waitress serving champagne, yet here she was, trapped against a wall, completely at his mercy. "You're the one who pulled me in here," she murmured, her voice betraying her unsteady breath. Gabriel chuckled, a deep, sinful sound that vibrated through her body. "I hate to admit it, but there's something about you, Isabella, something I just can't shake." His words were a sweet poison, laced with temptation. She wanted to believe they meant something, but how could she, when his lips hovered just above hers, his fingers trailing up her spine, setting her skin ablaze. Her mind screamed at her to walk away, to resist the pull he had on her. But when his lips ghosted over her jawline, his breath hot against her skin, she trembled. "Tell me you don't want this," he challenged, his voice dark, almost daring. Her lips parted, her tongue brushing over them in hesitation. It was a fatal mistake. Gabriel smirked, knowing exactly what that meant. Damn him. Damn her own weakness, but she wasn't going to give in that easily. "You think I'm just another one of your conquests?" Her voice was sharper now, but the way her body arched toward his betrayed her. Gabriel exhaled a slow breath, his gaze flickering with something dangerous. "Conquests are forgettable. You, Isabella." His grip tightened slightly on her waist, pulling her even closer. "You leave a mark." Her breath hitched, his fingers traced along the bare skin of her back, his touch setting off a wildfire inside her. She closed her eyes for a brief second, trying to suppress the wave of longing that threatened to overtake her. His lips brushed against her neck, a slow, torturous tease. "Let me show you how much I want you," he whispered against her skin. Shiver ran down her spine. The tension between them was unbearable. Her body was betraying her mind. Her hands, as if moving on their own, traced up his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. She tugged lightly at his shirt collar, the heat between them suffocating. Gabriel groaned low in his throat, pressing her firmly against the wall. This was madness. She knew it. He knew it. And yet, she was moments away from surrendering. Until a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. She sucked in a breath, reality slamming into her like a freight train. Gabriel didn't move, his body still pressed against hers, his dark gaze filled with something unreadable. The knock came again, louder this time. Isabella exhaled, finally finding the strength to push against his chest. His grip loosened, just enough for her to escape. She turned toward the door, her mind racing, but before unlocking it, she glanced over her shoulder. Gabriel stood there, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. "You can't treat me like I'm just another one of your flings," she said, voice steady despite the chaos inside her. Gabriel's lips curled slightly, but there was no amusement. In his eyes, "You're not." The certainty in his voice shook her more than she wanted to admit. Without another word, she unlocked the door and stepped out, leaving Gabriel Westbrook standing there, watching her walk away. But the last thing she heard before disappearing down the hall was his voice, low and full of promise. "This game is far from over, Isabella." Laughter echoed through the lavish ballroom, glasses clinking in celebration, as New York's elite indulged in their usual extravagant excess. But for Isabella Vasquez, everything around her had gone silent. Her heart pounded, her palms cold, despite the warmth of the grand chandelier lights above. She shouldn't have come here, but she needed answers. Her eyes locked onto Gabriel Westbrook. He stood effortlessly at the center of attention, surrounded by high-profile investors and models draped in designer gowns. a glass of whiskey balanced, casually in his hand. He hadn't seen her yet. Good, because she wasn't sure she could handle the intensity of his gaze after what had happened between them just an hour ago. Isabella stepped forward, willing herself to appear composed, though every inch of her was still burning from his touch. She just needed to confirm something. Was she just another one of his games? She got her answer a second later. Man. New. York is full of incredible women, one of Gabriel's friends chuckled, sipping his drink. But what about that waitress you've been fooling around with? Isabella's breath hitched. No. No. No, no. Gabriel smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass before responding. Oh, Isabella? He said with a casual shrug. She was fun. The world stopped. The floor beneath her feet seemed to vanish, replaced by a pit of ice that spread through her chest. She actually thought it meant something, he continued, chuckling as if the idea was ridiculous. Cute but naive, I get bored easily. I get... The laughter that followed was deafening. Isabella's fingers clenched around the small clutch in her hand, her nails pressing painfully into her skin. So that was it. The stolen glances, the way he touched her like she was the only woman in the world. The possessive way he had whispered her name, it had all been a lie. Her stomach twisted as bile rose in her throat, and then, as if sensing her presence, Gabriel's gaze lifted and met hers. A flicker of something passed through his expression. Shock? Regret? She wasn't sure, but it didn't matter. It was too late. The air around them grew unbearably heavy, the sounds of the party fading into a dull hum. People were starting to notice her now, glances darting in her direction, murmurs beginning to rise. She should leave. Walk away. Disappear before she embarrassed herself even more. But something inside her snapped. Isabella inhaled sharply, lifting her chin. She took a step forward, then another, until she was standing directly in front of him, her heart slamming against her ribs. Gabriel didn't move. Losing your touch, Westbrook, she said, her voice steady despite the hurricane raging. Inside her, a smirk pulled at the corner of his lips, but she saw through it. He wasn't expecting this. She tilted her head, her tone sharp as a knife. You bore easily. Her gaze flickered to his glass, the amber liquid reflecting the golden light. That's funny, because when I left you back there, her voice dropped lower, sultry. You didn't seem bored at all. A muscle in his jaw twitched, a satisfied warmth spread through her. Good. Let him squirm. The crowd around them was frozen, watching, waiting. Gabriel exhaled, finally setting his glass down. Isabella, but she didn't let him finish. She leaned in slightly, just enough for only him to hear. One day, she whispered, voice smooth as silk, when your world feels empty, when none of this is enough to fill that void you refuse to acknowledge, you'll remember me. His breath hitched. His eyes darkened. For the first time, Gabriel Westbrook looked like the one who had lost. Isabella smiled, sweet, taunting, lethal. Then she turned around and walked away. Her hands were trembling. Her chest felt tight. But she didn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Not until she was far enough away that the hurricane inside her couldn't tear her apart. She would never let herself be weak again. And as she stepped out into the cold New York air, she made a promise to herself. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The cold New York air stung Isabella Vasquez's face as she walked aimlessly through the city streets. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her heartbeat drumming in her ears, drowning out the sounds of passing cars and distant conversations. She wasn't crying. She refused to. Gabriel Westbrook's words still echoed in her head like a wound she couldn't stop pressing on. Fun, naive. I get bored easily. Had she really been so blind, so foolish? No. Not anymore. That night, standing alone on the Brooklyn Bridge, she made herself a promise. The Isabella Vasquez that Gabriel humiliated was gone. She would never let anyone make her feel small again. 5 years later, the rhythmic clack of her Louboutin heels against the marble floor of the Manhattan Plaza Hotel was sharp, precise, a sound of power. Heads turned as she walked through the grand lobby. The woman who had once been overlooked, underestimated, discarded, was now a force to be reckoned with. Isabella Vasquez was no longer just another girl in the crowd. She was the CEO of Vasquez Realty, a multi-million-dollar empire that dominated the real estate market. A polite, deferential smile greeted her at the reception desk. "Ms. Vasquez, your penthouse suite is ready. Welcome back to New York." She nodded, accepting the key card without breaking stride. She had no time for pleasantries. She had returned for one reason only, to remind Gabriel Westbrook exactly who she was now. Later that evening, Isabella stood on the private balcony of her suite, overlooking the glittering skyline of the city she had once been desperate to escape. A chilled glass of red wine rested in her hand, the deep aroma filling her senses as she took a slow sip. The taste was rich, bold. Victory tasted like Cabernet Sauvignon. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She glanced at the screen, a knowing smile forming on her lips as she answered. "Has he heard yet?" she asked, her tone smooth, controlled. A chuckle came through. "The line. Oh, he's heard." And judging by his reaction, he didn't take it well. The satisfaction that curled in her chest was almost sinful. "Perfect," she murmured, twirling the stem of her wineglass between her fingers. She could already picture the look on Gabriel's face. The same man who once dismissed her as nothing more than a distraction would now have to watch as she stood on equal ground with him, if not above him. The game had shifted, and this time, she was the one holding all the cards. Gabriel Westbrook swirled the amber liquid in his glass, staring at the city skyline from his penthouse office. The whiskey burned as it went down, but it wasn't the alcohol that was setting his veins on fire. It was her name, Isabella Vasquez. The woman he hadn't thought about in years, or so he told himself. And now, she was back. Not as the girl he once toyed with, but as the CEO of one of the most powerful real estate firms in the country. He clenched his jaw, setting the glass down harder than necessary. "What is it?" his business partner, Ryan Donovan, asked from the chair across his desk. Gabriel exhaled slowly, opening the email on his screen. His lips pressed into a thin line as he scanned the bold black letters staring back at him. Vasquez Realty, Westbrook Enterprises' newest competitor. He tapped his fingers against the desk, tension rolling through his shoulders. "She's coming for my market," Gabriel muttered. Ryan let out a low whistle. "Damn, you think she planned this?" Gabriel let out a dry laugh. "I don't believe in coincidences." Because he knew Isabella. She didn't just return. She calculated, and if she was back, then she wanted something. The nightclub was buzzing with energy, the dim lighting casting seductive shadows over the packed dance floor. Gabriel leaned against the bar, whiskey in hand, watching as the city's elite indulged in excess. But his focus was elsewhere. Then, as if summoned by pure will, she appeared. Isabella Vasquez stepped through the entrance like she owned the place. And maybe she did. The silky red dress she wore clung to her curves in a way that was designed to drive men insane. But it wasn't just the dress. It was her, the confidence, the effortless power. She had always been beautiful. But now she was devastating. Gabriel clenched his jaw as she moved through the crowd, completely oblivious to the stares she was attracting. Or maybe she knew. Maybe she wanted him to watch. And, God help him, he was. She reached the bar, ordered a drink, and nothing. No glance in his direction. No reaction, like he didn't exist. Gabriel's grip on his glass tightened. Oh, she was playing games now. He pushed off the bar and walked toward her, stopping just close enough for her to feel his presence before he spoke. "You're back," he murmured, voice low and controlled. She turned slowly, her movements deliberate as if she had all the time in the world. Her eyes met his, dark and unreadable, but the slight curve of her lips sent a rush of heat through him. "I never left," she replied smoothly, taking a sip of her wine. He let out a slow breath, tilting his head as he studied her. "You're different." A small, knowing smile played at the corner of her mouth. "So are you." The tension between them was electric, the air between their bodies charged with something neither of them wanted to name. Gabriel leaned in just slightly, enough for his breath to brush against her skin. "Tell me, Isabella, what is it that you want?" Her lips parted slightly, but her gaze remained steady. Then she did something he didn't expect. She leaned in, close enough that their noses almost touched, her voice a sultry whisper against his lips. "Nothing that you can give me." And just like that, she pulled away, turning her back on him for the second time in her life. Gabriel Westbrook never let anyone walk away from him, but as he watched Isabella disappear into the crowd, a slow smirk spread across his lips. This wasn't over. Gabriel Westbrook was a patient man. When he wanted something, he always got it. And tonight, what he wanted was standing across the room in a silk dress that made his blood run hot. Isabella Vasquez. She had ignored him. Twice. But Gabriel wasn't the kind of man to be ignored. He took a sip of his whiskey, his gaze never leaving her as she laughed softly at something one of the investors had said. The sound curled around him like smoke, making his fingers itch to touch her, to remind her exactly who he was. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight toward her. Isabella didn't react at first. She lifted her wineglass to her lips, took a slow sip, and only then, only when she was ready, did she acknowledge him. Her eyes met his, amusement flickering in the depths of her gaze. "Gabriel," she greeted smoothly, as if his presence was nothing more than an afterthought. He smirked, sliding into the empty seat beside her, his body close enough that their arms nearly touched. Close enough for her to feel him. "You're making a habit of avoiding me," he murmured, tilting his head slightly. "Should I be flattered or offended?" Isabella smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I don't avoid men who don't matter." The challenge was set. Gabriel exhaled a slow breath, his gaze flickering to the exposed curve of her collarbone, the soft pulse at her neck. She wasn't just playing, she was daring him. He leaned in just enough for his breath to ghost over her skin. "Is that so?" His fingers brushed over the stem of her glass, trailing lightly as if by accident. "Because from where I'm sitting, you're very aware of me." Her lips parted slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Your ego is still as unbearable as ever," she mused, taking another slow sip of wine. Gabriel chuckled, his fingers sliding under the table, his palm resting lightly on the smooth silk of her thigh. The reaction was immediate, a sharp inhale, a slight shift in posture. She still felt it, the tension, the heat, the undeniable pull between them, but instead of pulling away, Isabella did something that made his blood turn molten. She reached down, took his hand in hers, and moved it back onto his own lap. Her fingers lingered just a second longer than necessary. Enough to make a statement, enough to drive him insane. Then she leaned in, her lips brushing the shell of his ear. "Nice try, Westbrook." Gabriel's smirk didn't waver, but his pulse thundered in his veins. She wanted to play? Fine. He thrived in games like these. But what Isabella didn't realize yet was that no one played against Gabriel Westbrook and won. Gabriel Westbrook was not used to losing, and yet, as he watched Isabella Vasquez walk away, again, his jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around the crystal glass in his hand. She was toying with him, testing him, and, damn it, he was enjoying every second of it. But this wasn't over. Not even close. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. A private investors' dinner, exclusive to the biggest names in real estate. A gathering where alliances were made, deals were whispered over glasses of expensive wine, and, most importantly, where Gabriel and Isabella were forced into the same room again. She was already there when he arrived, seated at a table near the front, effortlessly commanding the attention of the men around her. Gabriel took his time walking over. Let her feel him before she saw him. And then, her posture shifted. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but he saw it. The way her shoulders straightened, the way her fingers paused briefly on the stem of her wineglass before continuing their slow, deliberate motion. She knew he was here. Good. Gabriel took the empty seat beside her, resting his arm. casually on the table, invading her space without touching her. "Isabella," he greeted, voice low, smooth. She turned her head, meeting his gaze with practiced ease. "Gabriel," she replied, her expression unreadable. He smirked, letting his fingers tap idly against the table. 2 nights in a row. People might start talking, he mused. She took a sip of her wine, unfazed. Let them. God, she was good. So damn good. But so was he. As the dinner progressed, the conversation between investors drifted toward the inevitable. Business, power, dominance in the market. Gabriel noticed how easily Isabella navigated the discussion, how seamlessly she commanded the room. It was intoxicating. But then, when no one was watching, he struck. Beneath the table, out of sight, his fingers brushed lightly against her knee. The reaction was immediate, a sharp inhale, a flicker of her gaze in his direction. He said nothing, kept his face neutral, but his hand stayed exactly where it was, waiting for her to stop him, for her to react, for anything. Instead, Isabella exhaled slowly and placed her hand over his. For a single charged moment, neither of them moved. Then, she took his hand, lifted it from her thigh, and placed it back onto his own. Gabriel bit the inside of his cheek to keep from smirking. Was fighting it, fighting him, and that only made him want her more. As the evening ended, she stood, smooth and composed, turning to him with a look that could shatter a man's will. "Better luck next time, Westbrook." Then, just before she left, she leaned down, her breath warm against his ear. "You should know." "I don't lose," Gabriel chuckled, shaking his head as she walked away. "Neither do I, Isabella, neither do I." The rain was relentless, hammering against the windows of the private hotel suite where Isabella Vasquez stood, her fingers gripping the edge of the marble counter. She had told herself she wouldn't do this. She had promised she wouldn't let him get to her again. And yet, he was behind her now, Gabriel Westbrook, a storm of his own. She could feel the heat of his presence without him even touching her. The room felt smaller, hotter, as if the air had thickened the moment he stepped inside. "This is a bad idea," Isabella said, her voice low, uneven. Gabriel didn't respond immediately. Instead, she heard the quiet sound of his footsteps, felt the shift in the air as he moved closer. "You're the one who let me in," he murmured. His voice was a sin in itself, dark, smooth, pulling her in like a slow, seductive tide. She should have turned around. She should have walked away. But when his fingers traced lightly down her arm, the sensation wrecked her. Isabella exhaled sharply, gripping the counter harder, fighting the pull. "Tell me to leave," Gabriel challenged, his breath teasing the sensitive skin of her neck. Her eyes fluttered shut. She couldn't. Because the truth was, she wanted this, had always wanted this. He must have sensed her hesitation because his hands settled on her waist, strong and sure. His fingers slid down over the silk fabric of her dress, testing, teasing, waiting for her to stop him. She didn't. Gabriel made a low sound of satisfaction, his lips ghosting just below her ear. "You drive me insane," he admitted. The confession sent a shockwave through her, because she felt it too, this undeniable destructive need. Isabella finally turned to face him, their bodies now barely an inch apart. The heat between them was unbearable. Gabriel's gaze dropped to her lips, his breathing uneven. His fingers slid along her jawline, tipping her chin up, forcing her to hold his stare. Then finally, he kissed her. The world ceased to exist. It was slow at first, a deliberate tease, but the moment she let out a quiet gasp against his lips, he lost control. His hands tightened around her waist, pulling her flush against him, his mouth devouring hers. The taste of whiskey lingered on his tongue, mixing with the addictive sweetness of her. Isabella's fingers fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, deeper, as if she could crawl inside him and never leave. They moved, tangled, desperate. When the backs of her knees hit the bed, he lifted her effortlessly, laying her down beneath him. His weight pressed her into the mattress, his lips trailing a scorching path down her throat along her collarbone. She arched beneath him, her nails digging into his shoulders. This was madness, but neither of them wanted to stop. Gabriel's mouth found hers again, his hands exploring, memorizing, claiming, and as the rain outside continued to fall, drowning out the sounds of the city, neither of them thought about the consequences. Not until it was too late. The golden glow of the early morning light slipped through the sheer curtains, casting soft shadows across the hotel suite. The air was thick with the remnants of last night, the heat, the hunger, the reckless decisions. Isabella Vasquez lay still, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of reality crash down on her like a tidal wave. What the hell had she done? Beside her, Gabriel Westbrook's slow, steady breathing was the only sound in the room. His arm lay draped possessively over her waist, his bare skin warm against hers. She closed her eyes, willing herself not to remember the way his hands set her on fire, not to remember how his mouth moved over her skin, how he murmured her name in that husky, half-broken way right before he shattered against her, not to remember how she let herself believe, even for a moment, that this was something more. Her chest tightened. This wasn't more. It could never be more. She needed to leave. Carefully, she slid out from under his arm, ignoring the way her body screamed in protest at the loss of his warmth. Every inch of her ached, a reminder of how desperately she had given in to him. She moved silently, reaching for her dress, slipping it back on with trembling hands. She had to get out of here before he woke up. But just as she turned toward the door, his voice stopped her. "You're running again." Isabella froze, her pulse spiking. She turned slowly, meeting Gabriel's half-lidded gaze, heavy with sleep but sharp with understanding. He was propped up on one elbow, the sheets hanging low on his hips. His hair tousled in a way that made him look both completely at ease and devastatingly dangerous. Her stomach flipped. "I'm not running," she said, forcing her voice to stay level. Gabriel arched a brow, his lips curving into something lazy, knowing, "Then why do you look like you just made the biggest mistake of your life?" "Because I did." But she didn't say that. Instead, she took a slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and met his gaze with all the strength she had left. This didn't mean anything. Something flickered across his face, something dark. Then just as quickly it was gone. Gabriel let out a soft, humorless chuckle, rubbing a hand down his face. "Is that what we're doing now?" he muttered. "Lying to ourselves?" Isabella's nails dug into her palms. She couldn't do this. Couldn't let herself believe that last night was anything but a moment of weakness. Because the second she started believing, she'd fall. And Gabriel Westbrook. He didn't catch people when they fell. She turned toward the door. "Goodbye, Gabriel." She didn't look back. Didn't see the way his expression hardened. Didn't see the way his fingers tightened around the sheets, his jaw locking as he watched her walk away. Again. The cold air. Outside did nothing to cool the heat still burning beneath Isabella Vasquez's skin. She walked briskly down the sidewalk, her heels clicking against the pavement, her heart a chaotic mess inside her chest. What had she been thinking? Sleeping with Gabriel Westbrook had been a mistake, a reckless, mindless surrender to something she had spent years building walls against. She had convinced herself she was immune to him. She wasn't, and that scared her more than anything. Her phone vibrated in her hand, dragging her from her spiral. She glanced down, a message from her assistant. "Urgent, call me ASAP." Isabella's stomach dropped. She pressed the phone to her ear as soon as the call connected. "What happened?" Her assistant's voice was clipped, hurried. "Something's wrong with the investors. They're pulling out, one by one." Her steps faltered. "What?" "I don't know who's behind it yet, but someone's poisoning your deals. Someone powerful." The cold, sinking feeling in her stomach was instant. She already knew who it was. Gabriel. The realization made her breath come short. She clenched her jaw, inhaling sharply through her nose. Of course he would try to destroy her just like he did years ago. She had been stupid to think their history, their night together, had changed anything. He was still the same man. And now, he was trying to win. Isabella wouldn't let him. That evening, she stormed into the exclusive gala where New York's most powerful gathered. Her black dress hugged her frame like armor, her heels sharp enough to be a weapon. Her target was easy to find. Gabriel Westbrook stood near the bar, perfectly composed, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking as if he hadn't just spent the day ruining her. Her nails dug into her palm as she marched straight toward him. His lips curled slightly as she approached, as if he had been expecting her. "Isabella," he greeted smoothly, taking a sip of his drink. She didn't slow, didn't hesitate. She grabbed his tie and pulled him toward her. People turned. Conversations quieted. But Isabella didn't care. She didn't stop until their faces were inches apart, until she could feel his breath on her lips. Gabriel's eyes darkened, his fingers wrapping around her wrist, holding her there. Daring her? Her voice was quiet, lethal. "You think you can break me?" Gabriel smirked, the flicker of amusement in his gaze infuriating. "I don't think, sweetheart. I know." Her grip on his tie tightened. God, she wanted to slap him, or kiss him. She hated him. And yet when his other hand brushed against her waist, sending a shiver racing through her, she knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Isabella Vasquez had spent years building herself from the ground up. She had clawed her way into the elite business world, forged alliances become untouchable. And in a matter of days, Gabriel Westbrook had managed to crack her empire's foundation. She sat at the long glass conference table in her firm's headquarters, her fingers gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. Across from her legal advisor and head of PR exchanged worried glances. "We're losing ground fast," one of them admitted. "Westbrook Enterprises has been quietly influencing key investors, making them doubt your ability to sustain your projects. It's subtle, but effective." Isabella's jaw clenched. Of course it was. Gabriel didn't do messy. He destroyed people with precision. With a smirk on his face and a whiskey in hand, rage bubbled inside her. But more than that, betrayal. For one stupid moment she had thought, no, she wouldn't go there. She exhaled, keeping her expression unreadable. "If Westbrook thinks he can ruin me, he's going to learn exactly what I'm capable of." A few heads turned at the ice in her voice. Good. She wouldn't let him win. That night, she went straight to him. Gabriel was waiting. Of course he was. He leaned against the sleek black sports car parked outside one of his hotels, the city lights casting shadows against his sharp features. His smirk was infuriating. "You look pissed," he mused, watching her approach. She stopped in front of him, her heels clicking against the pavement, her body vibrating with fury. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Gabriel pushed off the car slowly, his gaze traveling over her face, assessing. "No, sweetheart." His voice dropped lower, darker. "And neither do you." Her breath hitched, just for a second. His presence was overwhelming, a force she hated and craved all at once. She needed to remember why she was here. "I don't care what kind of power trip you're on, Westbrook," she bit out. "You don't get to play with my business like it's some kind of game." Gabriel tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Funny," he said, stepping closer, "because last I checked, you came back here to challenge me." Isabella's pulse pounded in her ears. Damn him, he was always 2 steps ahead. "You wanted a fight?" he murmured, his fingers ghosting over her wrist before she jerked away. "Well, sweetheart, now you have one." Her entire body was on fire, from rage, from frustration, from the undeniable, inescapable pull between them. But she wouldn't let him see it. She wouldn't let him win. She took a slow, deliberate step back, her lips curving into a smirk of her own. "Careful, Gabriel," she said smoothly. "Because the last time you underestimated me, you lost." Then she turned and walked away. But this time she wasn't running. This time she was coming for him. Isabella Vasquez had spent her entire life fighting to prove she didn't need anyone, especially not him. But as she stared at the numbers flashing across her laptop screen, the reality hit her like a freight train. She was losing. The investors were slipping through her fingers. The pressure was mounting. If she didn't find a way to stop it, Vasquez Realty, the empire she had bled for, would crumble. And the worst part, she knew exactly who could fix it. Her fingers hovered over her phone, heart hammering. She didn't want to call him. Didn't want to admit that after everything, she needed him. but pride wouldn't save her company. So she swallowed it and dialed. Gabriel Westbrook answered on the second ring. "Well, well," he drawled. "I was wondering when you'd break." Her teeth clenched. "I'm not breaking," she snapped. "I'm calling to make a deal." A beat of silence. Then his voice dropped, smooth as silk. "I'm listening." 30 minutes later, she was standing in his penthouse. Gabriel leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city below. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes told a different story. He had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to come to him. And God, she hated how good he looked doing it. "You want my help?" he asked, turning to face her. Isabella squared her shoulders. "I want my company back," she corrected. Gabriel took a slow step toward her. "And what are you willing to offer me in return?" Her stomach tightened. She knew this wasn't just business for him. It never had been, but she wouldn't play into his hands. "I'll match whatever deal you want," she said. "You get a stake in the development project, a real one." Gabriel exhaled through his nose, shaking his head with a smirk. "You think I want money?" He was close now. Too close. The scent of whiskey and cedarwood surrounded her, messing with her already frayed nerves. His fingers brushed her wrist, featherlight. "I don't want your business, Isabella." His voice was dangerous now. "I want you." The words sent a shockwave through her. Her pulse skyrocketed. She should have expected this, should have known that Gabriel never did anything without strings attached. She took a sharp breath, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "And if I say no?" His thumb grazed the inside of her wrist, making her shiver. "Then you walk out that door," he murmured, "and watch everything you built collapse." Her heart pounded, not just from anger, not just from fear, but from something much worse. Because what terrified her most wasn't that she might have to say yes. It was that a part of her wanted to. Isabella Vasquez had spent her entire life making ruthless, strategic choices. But standing in Gabriel Westbrook's penthouse, with his fingers ghosting over her wrist and his words wrecking her from the inside out, this didn't feel like a business decision. This felt like falling, and she had sworn never to fall for him again. Her throat was dry. "You think you can buy me?" Gabriel's lips curled slightly, but there was no amusement in his eyes. "I think you've spent the last 5 years trying to convince yourself you don't want this," he murmured, his voice thick with certainty. "Tell me I'm wrong." Her pulse pounded. Her body betrayed her. She should have turned away. Should have walked out that door, let her company burn if it meant keeping herself from getting burned by him again. But she didn't. Instead, she did. The one thing she had fought against since the moment she returned to New York. She closed the distance between them. Gabriel inhaled sharply, as if she had just knocked the air from his lungs. Her fingers curled around his shirt, her voice quiet but firm. "I hate you." A slow, dark smile spread across his face. "No, sweetheart." His hand slid to her jaw, tilting her chin up. "You hate that you still love me." The words sent lightning through her veins, and then his mouth was on hers. The moment their lips met, it was over. The anger, the fights, the push and pull, all of it burned away in the heat of their kiss. Gabriel didn't kiss like a man who had won a battle. He kissed like a man who had waited too damn long for this moment, like a man who was never letting her go again. Isabella melted into him, her fingers sliding up his neck, pulling him deeper, closer, rougher. Because she was done pretending, done running. She had already lost herself in him, and maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to be found. The New York skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, lights glittering like stars against the dark. The city was alive, but for the first time, Isabella Vasquez wasn't fighting against it. She stood on the penthouse balcony, a glass of wine in hand, the crisp night air brushing against her skin. Behind her, she felt him before he even spoke. Gabriel Westbrook, the man who had once broken her, the man she had spent years trying to forget, the man she had, despite everything, chosen. A warm hand slid around her waist, pulling her back against a solid chest. "You're quiet," Gabriel murmured, his breath brushing her ear. Isabella took a slow sip of her wine, letting the silence stretch. "I was just thinking," she finally said. He hummed in amusement. "That's dangerous." She smiled, leaning into him slightly. 5 years ago, if someone had told her she'd end up here? Not just back in Gabriel's orbit, but willingly staying. She would have laughed in their face. But here she was, and for the first time in a long time she wasn't afraid. Gabriel's lips pressed against her temple, his fingers tightening around her waist. "This time," he murmured, "I'm not letting you go." She turned in his arms, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. "I'm not going anywhere." A slow, knowing smirk curled on his lips. "Good." And as he pulled her in for a deep, lingering kiss, Isabella knew this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was love. No more games, no more running, just them, finally choosing each other. Sometimes love isn't about perfect timing or easy choices. Sometimes it's a battle, a collision of pride, passion, and unspoken truths. Isabella and Gabriel had to lose each other to truly understand what they meant to one another. But the real question is, would you have chosen love after everything? Tell me in the comments, could you forgive a love that once hurt you? Or would you walk away no matter how strong the connection? I want to hear your thoughts. And if you love stories filled with intense passion, power struggles, and undeniable chemistry, you won't want to miss what's next. Click the screen now to watch another irresistible love story that will leave you breathless.